Hi guys, Mr. Davis here. Hope you're well. This is the first of our lessons returning to section C of the A-level exam to do with sport and society. As usual now with our lockdown routine, what we'll do is we'll start off with a few knowledge recall questions, focusing just on a few general bits from what we looked at pre-Christmas time to do with sport in the pre-19th century and post-19th century. Post-industrial revolution, I should say. Okay, I'll leave you to read through the 4 questions. Make sure that you've got an answer written down for each of them, and we'll touch base shortly to check what information you have correct. Okay, so we'll go through each of these one at a time. There's a few options for some of these questions, so just make sure that you've got the correct information noted down. Purple pen your answers where required. So the first one, 3 characteristics of real tennis. So it's the kind of the key topic of what we're going to be looking at today is to do with tennis and the development and rationalization of lawn tennis. But fundamentally, it started with the game of real tennis. So 3 characteristics of real tennis. You could have had anything from being played by the upper classes in a more kind of civilized setup, complex rules. There was strategy and skill involved. It was a very, and it still is a very, very difficult and complicated game to play. Certainly not something that would have been widely played at the time or even now. Another key characteristic is the use of specialized equipment and facilities. So it wasn't like anyone could just rock up and have a game. You needed a particular set of expensive equipment, and even more so, you needed a particular facility to be able to play, because it was predominantly an indoor game, and for that to be played, you needed an indoor facility of quite some significant size and stature. So very much something for, the royals and the noble members of society, not something that would have been widely available. Predominantly played by men. It might have been that women were there or thereabouts paying attention to what was going on, but they would not really have engaged in the game, certainly not played it. High moral code. So, whilst it was a game and there was the rules and to a certain extent a competition, it was very much about participation and playing to the standards expected of those members of society, not just playing to win. So those were the key things for the characteristics. You may have got 1 or 2 others, but those were the key ones. Second question, an example of a sport in which the lower class and upper class might have participated together pre-industrial Britain. So if you remember, they were very much split in terms of what they would have participated in, but there were 1 or 2 activities that they might have ended up participating in at the same time. Main one being cricket. If you remember, when we looked at it, they would have had very different roles, and whilst they might have been in a team together, that was pretty much the end of that kind of equality within the game. They're unlikely to have spent any great time together. They would have come in to the clubs at separate entrances and kind of socialized with the different groups within the cricket group, and essentially had different roles once the game was up and running. Technically speaking, they participated together. You may also have thought of something like pedestrianism, where there was a certain involvement of lower class and upper class, but it was very much kind of different in terms of what their role was with that. If you're thinking of positions within society like the footmen, who used to essentially just carry the upper class, that was essentially what pedestrianism was. So some sort of races where they would have either had to carry something or somebody across a fairly long distance. That was what pedestrianism was all about. Third question, 3 factors which led to the growth of association football during the 20th century. So various different things. You could have had here a number of different options. Those including urbanization, something that we looked at in quite some detail. We're looking at the Industrial Revolution. and that movement of people from rural areas to industrial areas, and the reasons for that. Increased leisure time, so why that would have led to growth of football. Increased disposable income, so as people started to be slightly better paid in their work, and then maybe had a little bit more time available, they had that little bit more spare money where they could essentially travel and engage with sporting activities such as football. Improved transport system was a significant factor, meant that people could travel up and down the country, predominantly on things like trains, and as the road network developed, that was also something that enabled a much wider spread of people across different parts of the country, so they could either go and support their kind of local team, or if they were lucky enough to actually be involved in the game, then obviously they could have had fixtures and leagues start to develop and that sort of thing, predominantly because of that network of transport. Increased professionalism was another factor that we looked at. Increased organisation, and that kind of brought up a number of things which we've looked at to do with national governing bodies, codification of rules, so there was a set structure to the games that were being played now. It wasn't just kind of the local setup for each game. It was very much, if we're going to be playing different teams up and down the country, we need a similar set of rules or the same set of rules. And again, clubs, leagues and fixtures were all developed, and that had a significant impact on the development of the game. And finally, the key feature of the Bosman ruling. So something that we looked at briefly, which you need to be aware of, because it had, and it still does has a significant impact on how transfers are concluded in football. And the key feature was that there was freedom to move once the contract has expired. So if you had a 4-year deal and you stayed at the club for 4 years, once that contract was up, you could then decide to move on to another club. You wouldn't have been kind of held by that club to stay, even though the contract was up, which was essentially what happened previously. And it put a lot of emphasis on player power and signing on fees. So when you've got essentially a free transfer, that's what that's all about. It all came about from the Bosman ruling. Okay, so the key topic that we're going to be looking at today, and it just kind of links into a lot of what we were looking at previously, to do with post-industrial revolution and sport and society. And this focuses on essentially on lawn tennis and the rationalization and development of modern day lawn tennis and how that impacted on participation. Some key terms that we're just going to use during the presentation today, so just make sure you've got a note of them. Title, date, learner objective and key terms neatly noted down, please. Okay, so hopefully this is something that you might have some level of familiarity with, but just to get us up and running, we need to be clear on the key features of lawn tennis. So let's start with, you might get a few ideas just from the pictures there, some of the things that might jump out at you, but certainly from this first picture, the kind of the setting and the people that might have been involved. So who do you think was primary group involved in participating in lawn tennis in terms of the classes? So the key group was the middle class. So they essentially invented the game with kind of aspirations of being involved in a form of tennis, but essentially not being able to play for various reasons, not being able to access and play real tennis, which was still, although dwindling, a game that was played by the upper class. So this was something essentially an alternative that was invented and then played by middle classes. And the reason why it suited them, amongst others, was the time that they had available, not having to work, or certainly not having to work as much as the lower classes. The money that they had, whether that was through family and inheritance and close contacts with potentially people involved in the more upper class, that had kind of filtered down into their family, and then from that, kind of the availability of their facilities. So essentially, their homes were where they were able to play the game. They had kind of urban areas where they had their home, and larger gardens with kind of a lawn area that they were able to set up and play the games on. So essentially, that allowed them to play the game. And it also kind of just enabled them to play it in a certain level of privacy, because they had walls and hedges around the garden, which meant that the prying eyes of the lower class couldn't kind of get involved, and were essentially excluded from participating, certainly at the time. The organisation element of it was also important. So if you think about the education that the middle classes may have had, and their roles moving through from kind of educational setup and into potentially positions of authority within society, and particularly in terms of their positions in relation to sport with national governing bodies and the organisation of those, that actually meant that it was a game that was structured and organised. So there were clubs, there were leagues, not leagues, but there was an organisation to it, and they had an understanding of where the game was being played and who was able to play it, and how to develop it further. Equipment was obviously a key thing. So this individual here was quite crucial to that, Major Walter Clopton Wingfield. So he developed his own kind of tennis set, and it had a kind of a fancy name that was sold around the world, but essentially it included the absolute essentials for the game. So the rackets, the net posts, and some balls, and it gave a basic set of instructions how the game was to be set up if you were going to just play it in your garden. So a kind of what was essentially a kind of hourglass shape to the court with a net in the middle, and then it just enabled people who wanted to play, as word got round that this was an entertaining way of passing their time. People could purchase the equipment, and with a bit of space in their back garden, they could essentially play the game. And that was far more accessible than what real tennis would have been, where a significant amount of money was required just to set it up in terms of facilities and equipment. So the actual standardization of the rules was crucial as well. So whilst this individual had his own version of the game that was set up, it was actually once kind of Wimbledon got involved, and Wimbledon was essentially a croquet club to begin with. So if you're not sure what croquet is, do a little bit of a Google search on that. But essentially, it was a game that was played on the lawn of Wimbledon, and with middle class families, and having that set up enabled them to then be able to play a game like tennis. And they set up a more standardized, straightforward set of rules. For instance, they just made the court more of a rectangle rather than this odd hourglass shape, and it just meant that it was a more straightforward game to play. One of the other key features was the fact it was very much a social game, and this was a huge difference. So rather than real tennis, which was predominantly participated in by men, the lawn tennis version of the game was being played by males and females. So families could play together, women could play, and the general idea was that it wasn't such a vigorous, certainly not a violent game, and it was something that females could play and not be seen to be kind of unladylike. Sometimes they played together, sometimes it was something that women played amongst themselves as a way of just keeping fit and healthy. But like I say, it was an activity that was essentially minimum exercise and minimum intensity, and they could still play in their kind of formal, as you can see here, the kind of get up that they had there. It wasn't like they had to kind of come along and play in a sort of state of undress, they could still play relatively easily, and that was crucial in terms of their initial involvement in the game. This was the set, by the way. This was the kind of example of the lawn tennis set that Major Walter Clopton Wingfield patented and kind of sold. You don't necessarily need to know his name, but the idea that it was something that was widely available was a crucial factor in terms of the development. Just make sure you've got notes down for each of those things before we move on. Okay, so one of the key things to do with this part of the topic and the course is to do with the involvement of women and how the link between lawn tennis and the participation of women. So the things that you just need to think about here before we go into it in a bit more detail is how would the growth of lawn tennis benefited women and women's participation, and why would the game be well suited to women? So we just touched on a few reasons just then, but let's just consider it in a little bit more detail. So just pause the video, have a think. Okay, so we'll just go through these reasons, and like I say, some of them we've already touched on, but just make a nice, clear, separate list of these as we go through them. So women were able to be kind of energetic and involved in a sporting activity that wasn't considered kind of highly intense, vigorous, and violent. So it enabled them to play with a level of kind of class and elegance, and have the benefit of their participation to their health and fitness to a certain extent, and enjoyment, but not seen as being something that was overly intense and vulgar to a certain extent. Okay, as I said, something that could be played by whole families, so it wasn't that women were shunned and kind of discarded to the side to make the tea and things. They were actively engaged in as a family game where they could all play together. And the slow kind of involvement and growth of this started to remove these stereotypes that women couldn't play these games. So as soon as it became clear that it was something they could quite easily engage with, it started to knock back any previous stereotypes and myths that people might have had about women's actually involvement in the game and any sort of sporting activity. As they got involved on a kind of on a more personal kind of family level, they were also able to get involved and join clubs that might have been developed in the local area. So if it was a case where a group of people maybe for one reason or other didn't quite had the money but didn't have the space or the facilities to develop their own courts, they actually just developed clubs where they could meet and participate together, and women were openly able to join those clubs, whereas previously that wouldn't have been something that they would have been able to do. Even now, one of the most significant reasons for the growth of female sport in general, and was the case then, was that obviously at a lower level, it was played in schools, in girls' only schools. Lawn tennis would have been something that in the kind of recreational time they would have been able to play, and as soon as that started to happen, it meant that there was a kind of a stream of involvement. As girls grew older and left school, they could continue to play the game. Key feature, as I said before, was the aspect of clothing and the fact that they didn't have to wear or kind of any sort of undress that would have kind of revealed any excessive amount of skin. They had to be fairly well covered up at all times, and they were able to play in that way. I mentioned the idea of the privacy. So within these gardens, you can kind of see it here, the kind of the fencing, the hedging, the walls that they would have had, and that offered an element of privacy. So kind of gawping eyes of maybe the lower class who might have been passing and just fancied seeing what was going on, particularly with the women's involvement in the game. That enabled them to just play with a level of privacy which was key to their involvement. It was very much a social element rather than a sporting thing. So it wasn't a competition. They weren't playing to win or anything like that. It was very much around the idea of enjoyment, some health benefits, some family time, and a social gathering rather than anything more serious. Okay, right, the next part of this is just looking at the working class. So we've mentioned about the middle class and women at this early stage of the development, but one of the things you've then kind of got to flip over, which you might get asked about, is why the game would have been less immediately widely available to the working class. So to a certain extent, you've just got to flip the reasons over, like of all the reasons why the middle class it would have suited them, think of now the reasons why it wouldn't have been suitable for the working class. So just take a moment to think. And again, we just need a nice, concise list before we go on. So thinking about it, and like I say, a lot of these are just kind of turned over comments or points that you could make in the exam for this sort of question. So whereas the middle class would have had that time and availability to be able to do participate in lawn tennis, the working class would just not have had that. They would have still been working, fairly long hours, and they just wouldn't have had the time to be able to engage in something like lawn tennis. Again, finances is a huge factor here. So again, middle class would have had that disposable income, essentially the spare money, so they could afford these equipment sets. They could afford to set up their gardens in this way. But the working class just wouldn't have had that. They didn't have that disposable income. Any money that they did have was essentially for food and for just the welfare and the upkeep of their family. They couldn't afford something like a lawn tennis kit. Initially, it was very much a kind of amateur game. And remember, when we're talking about amateurs, it's not how the modern day amateurs are seen now. So back then, the amateurs were the slightly more elite group in society who would have not played for money, certainly not played to win. It's not to say that they wouldn't have been good. They were often the higher level of performers, certainly initially, because they were able to play more often. So lawn tennis was very much fitted into that idea that it was very much an amateur focus. The middle and upper classes would have been the groups that would have been playing tennis and lawn tennis and also real tennis, but very much lawn tennis would have been dominated by the middle class and the amateur ideology that went along with that. The working class wouldn't have been able to join these clubs, so it would have been categorically, you are not able to come in and participate in the game here. So even though there were these facilities where which provided opportunities for middle class people who maybe didn't have their own courts that they could play on or wanted to play on, the working class were not invited in to be involved in that. And so essentially that avenue of participation was just completely shut down until much later on, where lawn tennis started to filter down and people could play in parks and things like that. But initially it just wasn't something that they would engage in. So yeah, the lack of public provision kind of goes hand in hand with that. And just the general values that they would have had and the overall setup for working class, it just wasn't aligned with something like lawn tennis, whether it's to do with just general etiquette and codes of conduct and dress codes and values that they would have held that were very much a part of the lawn tennis setup at the time. The working class would have just not fitted in with that at all, and it just meant that they were kind of at opposite ends of where they would have needed to be to link up. So whereas it was very well suited to middle classes, it just didn't link up to anything to do with the values and whatnot of the working class. So just make sure you've got each of those down so you're clear. The reasons why it was well suited to the middle class, the reasons why women would have had an involvement and certainly a growing involvement in lawn tennis as the game developed, and then also the working class and why it wouldn't have been well suited to the working class. Okay, just a bit of kind of general background information here before we get into some of the more detailed information to do with this. So obviously time passes on and the game develops, and one of the key reasons for that development was that the game spread all over the world, and there were tournaments and competitions that started to be taking place. Australia, France, obviously Wimbledon took on tennis, and the Wimbledon Championships as we know it now was a kind of a growing feature of the sporting calendar back then, but also in America. So the game was spreading. There was a professional tour and tournaments that started to happen as early as the 1920s. So people were taking the game very, very seriously. And whilst at that stage, the majors, so the Australian Open, the French Open, Wimbledon, the US Open, which continue to be the four majors for tennis today, whilst at the time they were very much amateurs only. So if you were a professional and you were playing for money on this tour and involved in these other tournaments that were taking place, you wouldn't have been able to take part in what were essentially the four most prestigious tournaments, which were the amateur majors, or the Grand Slams as we know them today. But people were taking part, and it was a kind of a growing game across the world. Players realized that they could earn a lot of money from tennis, and by their involvement in these tours and tournaments, it became a growing element of the game, particularly for the men who started to earn more and more significant amounts of money as time passed on. So yeah, at the time it was initially very much a kind of an amateur-only setup for the Grand Slams or for the majors. But like I say, there was this professional element that started to develop. And because of that, then commercial opportunities grew. So sponsorship and kind of as time passed on through the early kind of 20th century, sponsorship and the media involvement became quite significant. And obviously with that, the earnings and the development of the game grew significantly. There was this idea of shamateurism. So shamateurism is essentially amateurs start to take money for their involvement in the game, and whether that was through payment of competitions, or whether it was just kind of backhanded payments that they were receiving. But essentially what that led to was the development of what's known as the open era, because it just became a messy setup where amateurs were starting to actually play and get involved in these events for money, and that kind of totally went against the amateur ideals. So at the time, the open era developed, and what that essentially meant was that all players could compete in all of the tournaments. So there wasn't a professional setup, and then on the side at certain amateur tournaments, the open era essentially led to a professional tennis circuit, which included the four majors there. And then as time grew, the tour or the circuit for tennis grew, TV rights grew, popularity of the game grew, and it was a kind of a significant factor. This open era was a major kind of turning point in the game. Said about the media and sponsorship. One of the things just to be aware of, and it's still very much a kind of a current feature of the game, is this idea that tennis is still seen as or perceived as a middle class sport. So if you think about, if you were going to ask everyone in school if you played tennis before, maybe they would have played a bit in PE lessons, but not so many people would have maybe engaged in tennis at clubs. And one of the reasons for that is it still holds this idea that it's a middle class sport, that you have to have a certain amount of money to play, to pay for equipment, for lessons. Even some clubs still insist on certain clothing to be worn. Even Wimbledon now is still a white clothing only. So even for all the fancy clothing that they might wear around everywhere else and all the other tournaments, Wimbledon's is still very much whites only in terms of the clothing. So it still holds that that idea that it's not a sport for the masses. And finally, in terms of just the general thing, there was a kind of a general fight, and this links in with the idea of the feature of female participation, a fight for equal prize money, which was kind of led by this female hero here. I don't know if you may not recognise her, and that's someone called Billie Jean King, who was one of the most successful tennis players, male or female, of all time. Incredibly athletic and incredibly successful. But during her career, she was a kind of at the forefront of fighting for equal prize money, where she would have given a very good game and certainly could have easily competed with many of the top male players. But her prize money and the prize money that was being awarded to women for their success in the same tournament as men was significantly lower. So, for instance, in 1968, the winner of Wimbledon, Rod Laver, got £2,000. That Billie Jean King only got £750 for winning the same tournament. And it's up until only fairly recently, certainly at Wimbledon, that's kind of leveled off a little bit, and that now men and women are awarded the same amount of prize money, and the prize money is absurd now. It's huge, but it wasn't until 2007 where men and women were awarded the same prize money at Wimbledon. Other tournaments did it a little earlier, but it's significant that it took that long for that to happen. So, just getting into some of the specifics now in terms of the growth and development of the game. What you need to think about is why it's grown. Why has it grown so significantly during the kind of the mid 19th century through to today? What are the key reasons for that growth? And to a certain extent, some of these are kind of generic across different sports that you think are kind of major sports that take place today. But why do you think tennis would have grown so much during that time? What sorts of things would have influenced that? Just have a think and we'll come up with a list together. Okay, so you could have any number of things for this, but let's just keep it fairly concise. So the fact that it was invented and played by the middle classes was significant, because it meant that they were a key group in society. They had money and they had influence, and that meant that it contributed significantly to the growth of the game. Whereas some of those lower class games that you would have learnt about earlier in the year have obviously died off, for various reasons. But sports and activities like lawn tennis still very much played pretty much on the same set of rules that was developed in the kind of early mid 19th century. It's the same sort of game, the same court, same racket, same basics that underpin the game, and that shows the influence that the middle classes would have had. This specialist equipment, and if you think about how equipment and the value of equipment with technology and things have developed, and the money that's involved in that side of the game, that's contributed towards the growth of the game, because it becomes something that drives the game, and young people particularly want to invest in and have the latest equipment, and there's always new products coming out, and as that equipment develops, it enables the game to develop as a whole as well. The generalized, standardized rules was absolutely crucial for the development of the game, because it meant it was fairly straightforward to play, and as long as you knew the basics, you could spread the game globally. If it was far more complicated and not easy to understand, that would have significantly impacted on how the game grew over time. It would have just been too complicated and probably would have died out. Not too dissimilar to real tennis, because it was more straightforward and easily accessible. There was a set of rules, everyone kind of got it, and that's contributed towards the growth and development of the game. Obviously, the fact it was played by men and women, again, some of those sports were originally, like real tennis, were very much geared towards men only. Then you're cutting out, pretty much half the population there by limiting who can actually play. So the fact that this was something that men and women and families could easily engage in and continue to engage in was significant. There was, whilst we focused on the kind of early mid-19th century, the idea that it was middle class only and that lower classes, there was a huge delay in their involvement, but eventually they caught up as well. And the fact that, it's something that is now widely played in parks and things like that, and you don't necessarily need that huge amount of money, whilst there's still an element of financial capability that someone needs to play tennis, which is maybe different for something like football or even basketball. You do need some money, but there's a public provision there that you can just go and rent rackets for like £1 or £2 and a court. You don't have to have your own facilities or equipment. The professional aspect and the media involvement and the sponsorship and everything that all the hype that goes along with that, as soon as that becomes an integral part of the game, it contributes hugely to the growth of the game. So any game where which becomes professional and has that professional element to it, along with the media involvement, the two kind of go hand in hand. There's not many, like for instance with football and women's football, professional women's football was not going anywhere really until the media, until sponsorship, and until investment became a key part of it. And as soon as that happened, it enabled players and clubs to become professional units, and that's then driven the game, and the whole kind of thing just snowballs from there. And the same sort of thing happened with tennis. As soon as there's that element of professionalism and a media interest and money and financial investment, that has a huge impact. Okay, and just to kind of round it all off, because the idea of female participation has been significant on this whole topic. Just to finish off with, what factors have led to the continued growth and success of women's tennis? So again, to a certain extent, these are generic things across different sports, but why has women's tennis continued to grow and be successful? Just take a moment to have a think, and we'll come up with one last list. Okay, so the first one, so the growth of what's called the WTA Tour. So this is essentially a split off from the men's tour, where females decided to kind of break away. They weren't happy with how things were set up and the fact that they had to always be fighting for a kind of level playing field. The WTA is now is a huge part of women's sport generally. And whilst there's some discussions now about combining the tours again, so there's not to kind of create a more straightforward system. There's still quite a lot of discussion going on about that, but it's something big players like Federer and Murray have championed, because there's still a little bit of a kind of discrepancy currently with how those tours kind of operate. It just complicates things having two separate tours, two separate circuits of competitions, where the women might be playing in one competition and the men might be playing in a different competition. The popularity of the game, and particularly the majors, is when the men and the women are playing at the same event. But that's something that isn't quite in place yet. But the general growth of the tour, as they decided to kind of break away, was significant in developing the game and getting their own kind of equal footing on investment and sponsorship and media involvement. Equal prize money, as I said, was a significant thing, and it took some time for some of the biggest competitions and tournaments like Wimbledon to catch up. But eventually, that is pretty much now the case, and you've got people like this young lady Naomi Osaka, who's one of the very best female tennis players in the world now, kind of overtaken people like Serena Williams, and is now winning the biggest tournaments and earning huge money, not just from actual involvement in the events, but also in terms of sponsorship, and the money that she generates, in terms of, she's originally from Japan, so that money from that part of the world is huge, absolutely massive. Because she's now based and lives and trains in America, she kind of gets the benefit of both sides of that. But yeah, that was a significant thing in driving the game for women. Sponsorship deals, so she's like a global icon now. She would be making more money every year now than any female athlete ever in any sport. She would be the highest gross earning female athlete of all time in any individual year, and you might not have ever heard of her, but she'd be earning more money now in a year than Serena Williams or the top female footballers, basketball players, athletes. She would be number one. The investment then that comes with that, their interest in the media, and the whole hoopla that comes along with these big events, it's all driven by finances. And if you've got that financial investment coming in, it's going to have a huge impact on the development of the game. So the fact that that's there contributes massively. The media coverage, so all of these things kind of come together under the bubble of kind of global interest in the game. And then from that, you get people like Naomi Osaka, you get your Serena Williams, you get your Coco Gauffs, who's this 16-year-old sensation from America, playing tennis, and the huge amount of influence and interest in her. That drives the game, that drives female participation. If you didn't have that, that would be a significant barrier to participation. But because of their growing influence and the interest in the women's game, they are role models in the same way that Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer are. So it has a huge bearing on kind of continued involvement and growth of participation. So this is just a quick run through of the key things that we've looked at today. It's not necessarily a topic that lends itself to huge, like those level mark questions, but it is something where there'll be 3 or 4 mark questions where you have to give 3 reasons for this or 3 examples of this, and potentially quite a few marks in the exam could focus on this. So hopefully something that you found useful. Just to clarify the things that you need to be clear on. Key characteristics of lawn tennis. So we've looked all the way up to the initial development of the game. What are the key characteristics of that early lawn tennis? How the growth of lawn tennis contributes towards the emancipation. So that's the kind of the freedom, if you like, and the breaking down of barriers for women's participation. How has lawn tennis contributed towards that? Why was there a delay in the game spread into the working class? So that was something that we looked at after looking at those characteristics and why it was well suited to the middle class. Why was there such a lag in getting it to the working class? What were the reasons for growth of lawn tennis from the mid-19th century to today? So all those different factors that contribute towards lawn tennis. I mean, it's still termed lawn tennis, but obviously it's played now on various different surfaces, but technically it's still classed as the same game as lawn tennis. Why is it such a huge game now? What sort of factors have contributed towards the growth? And why the women's game continues to grow. So that was the stuff that we've literally just touched on the previous slides about why women's lawn tennis, why is that such a massive game now? How is it that they've managed to get the women's tennis on a level playing field to that of the men? And that, guys, is that. Hopefully you've made some good notes. Get them over to me once they are complete, please, and we will have a little review in our next lesson. Okay, bye-bye.